After reaching max level with all 4 of Final Fantasy XIV's tanks, it's only natural that I've formed some opinions about their effectiveness and what makes them unique and interesting. Today we're going to talk about, compare, and contrast the 4 tanks in Final Fantasy XIV. Let's get started. Instead of talking about each of the tanks individually and talking about their strengths and weaknesses, I want to compare them all to the Paladin. And this is not because I think the Paladin is the strongest, but because the Paladin is the most classic style of tank. It's got a sword, it's got a shield, it's very sturdy and very straightforward. Especially with regards to how it defends itself. It doesn't use any fancy tactics to mitigate damage. You press the button, you mitigate the damage, and you're good to go. So first up, we'll look at the Paladin versus the Warrior. This, to me, is the most interesting comparison because the Paladin and the Warrior are like opposites. The Paladin has to choose between fighting and healing or support, and the Warrior seamlessly does them both, and that's a huge value point for the job. The main thing we're going to look at here is Equilibrium and Warrior's other healing abilities versus Clemency. To start off, Clemency and Equilibrium have the same potency, but they have completely different functionalities. Clemency can be used on other players or yourself, but it has several downsides. It interrupts combos, it has a casting time, it drains MP that's used for your offensive magic damage rotation. What that means is Clemency is an emergency tool most of the time. So despite me loving this spell so much and all the power that it brings, all the sustainability that comes with Clemency, I don't cast it very often. In fact, I've gone through entire dungeons without having to even press the Clemency button once, and that is a bit unfortunate, but I understand why that's a thing. On the other hand, Equilibrium and Thrill of Battle, Warrior's 2 healing abilities, can only be used on yourself, but they're instant cast off the global cooldown. They're less versatile, but they're better for the Warrior. What I mean by that is Clemency has huge value for the team when the shit hits the fan. But Equilibrium and Thrill of Battle can be used throughout every single encounter, so it's not as niche. So when I'm tanking with the Warrior, Equilibrium and Thrill of Battle become integral parts of my mitigation. During a big dungeon pull, if I'm taking too much damage, I'll activate Thrill of Battle and Equilibrium to top myself off, make things a little bit smoother for the healer. If I'm fighting a boss and a tank buster's coming in, I'll activate Thrill of Battle, the tank buster will hit me, I'll take whatever amount of damage, I'll use Equilibrium to top myself off again. And this is all done without interrupting combos, without breaking my rotation, without disrupting the flow of battle at all. And that is a huge value point. The last healing ability for the Warrior is Nascent Flash, and this is also the off-tank support ability for the Warrior. On activation, you grant the buff Nascent Flash to yourself and Nascent Glint to your teammate. While Nascent Flash is active, a portion of all the damage you deal is converted to HP, and the teammate with Nascent Glint gets 50% of the HP that you receive. The party member that received Nascent Glint also has their damage taken reduced by 10%. So besides the obvious functionality of using it as the off-tank, casting Nascent Flash on the main tank when a tank buster is coming in, if you're main tanking and you know the rotation of the boss's damage output, you can use Nascent Flash as a consistent source of healing. This is also true in dungeon pulls. Something important to keep in mind though with Nascent Flash is that its effectiveness scales up with the amount of damage you're doing. What that means is if you cast Nascent Flash and use Overpower and Heavy Swing, you're not going to receive a lot of healing, but if you combo Nascent Flash with Chaotic Cyclone, with Inner Release and Fell Cleave, you're going to see massive healing. If you're doing a big wall-to-wall dungeon pull, the healing output is going to be stupid. But even during boss fights, I've played around with the idea of using Nascent Flash instead of Raw Intuition to mitigate the damage of tank busters. I see a tank buster coming in, I activate Nascent Flash, I use Infuriate, then follow up with Inner Chaos, and I receive about 20,000 health from the heal. So again, this goes back to the idea that the Warrior has interesting ways that it can choose to defend itself, depending on the situation, what abilities you have access to. You can decide to go down the route of, okay, I'm going to heal myself through this tank buster or through this damage, or I'm going to go the traditional route and just mitigate the damage with skills like Rampart, Vengeance, and Raw Intuition. And that's in contrast with the Paladin. Your decisions are always the same. You mitigate the damage, no questions asked. Next up, we're going to compare the Paladin to the Gunbreaker, and this one is weird. My gut instinct wants to say that the Gunbreaker is weaker than the Paladin in terms of defense, but when I look at the Gunbreaker's kit as a whole, it does a lot of things to make that feel not true. First up, Sheltron is the Paladin's low cooldown mitigation tool. It gives you a 100% block rate for 6 seconds. That means you are going to reduce your damage taken by 20% for 6 seconds. Heart of Stone reduces your damage taken by 15%, but the duration is 7 seconds, so you receive less mitigation per hit, but it lasts for 1 second longer. The Gunbreaker also has one more personal mitigation cooldown than the Paladin has access to. The Gunbreaker has Heart of Stone, Rampart, Nebula, and Camouflage. The Paladin has Sheltron, Rampart, and Sentinel. Now, Camouflage isn't insanely powerful, but it's not weak by any stretch of the imagination. It increases parry rate by 50%, and it reduces your damage taken by 10%. So it gives you a huge advantage against physical damage attacks, and a decent advantage against everything else. The Gunbreaker's self-healing ability Aurora is also fascinating in this conversation as well. In terms of raw output, Clemency is always going to beat it, but again, just like Equilibrium, it can be used off the global cooldown so it doesn't break your combos or your offensive rotation in any way. To take things a step further, Aurora is a heal over time. The cure potency is 200 and it has a duration of 18 seconds. What that means is Aurora feels a lot more like passive mitigation, similar to the Paladin's blocking. The Gunbreaker also has Brutal Shell as a part of their 1-2-3 combo. It applies a shield and a small heal whenever the combo bonus is applied. Paladin, though, still has the edge in large groups because you're not going to be using Brutal Shell when you're fighting 15 enemies at the same time, but against a boss, Brutal Shell is incredibly valuable. With all of that said, when I look at the Gunbreaker, it's similar to the Paladin in that its rotation is straightforward and static, and the ways that you defend yourself are always pretty much the same. But it takes a more active approach to mitigating damage. While the Paladin just sits around and passively does things with blocking, and whenever a tank buster comes up, they use Sheltron Rampart, Sheltron Sentinel, the Gunbreaker can spread out their cooldowns more evenly to give themselves a sensation of passive mitigation similar to blocking. You activate Camouflage when auto attacks are going out, and you're going to reduce your damage taken by 10% and occasionally get a parry for 15% more mitigation. If you activate Aurora every time it's ready, you're going to get that heal over time for 18 seconds. And then when the tank busters come, Heart of Stone Rampart, Heart of Stone Sentinel. Last but certainly not least, we have the comparison of Paladin to Dark Knight. I saved this one for last because this one is special. I think the Dark Knight is incredibly powerful in the right context. And even when that right context isn't there, the Dark Knight still holds its own. The ability Dark Mind is a unique cooldown to the Dark Knight. It reduces magic damage taken by 20% for 10 seconds on a 60-second cooldown. And most people throw this ability away. They don't even consider using it. They take it off their hotbar completely, and that's a bad idea. Despite the fact that this ability is situational, it is not shitty by any stretch of the imagination. Just because you don't get to use an ability all the time doesn't make it bad. The way I like to phrase this, just because something is situational doesn't mean it's shitty. And there's obviously a spectrum to it. If you have an ability that's so situational that there's only one boss fight in the entire game where it's valuable, then it's a bad ability and it needs to be redesigned. But Dark Mind has functionalities in almost every boss fight in the game, especially at level 80. Titania Extreme and Innocence Extreme both use magic damage tank busters. 3 of the 4 bosses in the Eden normal mode raid use magic damage tank busters. Finally, several bosses in the current list of expert dungeons use magic damage tank busters or raid-wide damage. This means Dark Mind is going to get value in a lot of places in the game once you reach max level, and even before you reach max level, there's magic damage going out here and there. Besides talking about Dark Mind, the Blackest Knight is the tool in Dark Knight's arsenal that sets it apart from the Paladin. Instead of just mitigating tank busters and reducing your damage taken so that instead of taking 40,000 damage you take 20,000, the Dark Knight, when used correctly, can reduce the damage of big tank busters to 0. And in certain encounters, you can reduce other damage sources to 0 as well. I was experimenting with the Blackest Knight against the Street Sharks in the Academia dungeon. In addition to reducing the damage of those bosses' tank busters to 0, when the bosses jump back onto the platform and do their little splash attack, you can reduce that damage taken to 0 as well. Now this damage is completely avoidable, but this is something that you can play with for unavoidable damage. The final boss in the Academia dungeon does a lot of raid-wide damage, and when that damage is coming out, a well-timed Blackest Knight will absorb all of the damage from the hit, and the boss's follow-up auto attacks will cause the shield to break, which will give you access to Dark Arts. The way I explained this in a previous video is Dark Knight seamlessly blends their offensive kit and their defensive kit together with the Blackest Knight, Dark Arts, and the Flood and Edge of Shadow attacks. Damage is coming in, you spend 3000 MP to activate the Blackest Knight. If the attack is strong enough to break the shield, boom, the shield gets broken and you follow up with some damage. So you're spending your MP and your resource on defense, and if that shield gets broken, you're rewarded with offense. With all of that said about the Dark Knight, there are some things in the Dark Knight's kit that need tweaking. The ability Abyssal Drain is pretty good sustain if you're fighting a large group of enemies. It deals 200 potency worth of damage, and it has a cure potency of 200, so if you hit 10 enemies with that, you're getting a lot of healing. But the cooldown on this ability is 60 seconds, and that doesn't feel incredibly valuable. I think the cure potency should be a little bit higher to give Abyssal Drain some value in single target encounters and group encounters. We also have the Salted Earth ability. This is a damage over time ability that you place on the ground, and it has a 90-second cooldown but a 15-second duration. The potency of the damage over time effect is only 60. For a 90-second cooldown, I would expect Salted Earth to have an additional effect attached to it somewhere. Maybe you take less damage when you're standing in Salted Earth. Maybe you restore MP while you're standing in Salted Earth. Maybe you generate blood and MP passively while you're standing in Salted Earth. Whatever the case is, the ability in its current form doesn't feel like it does enough, and there are a lot of things that could be done to it to add to the identity of the Dark Knight. But to close out my section about the comparison of Paladin to Dark Knight, the ability to reduce your damage taken to 0 consistently throughout a fight, almost every 15 seconds or whenever the damage is coming through, that is a huge value point for the Dark Knight, and especially when you're going up against a boss that's doing a lot of magic damage, I want to be a Dark Knight in those situations. The Paladin is cool, it gets the job done, blocking is great, but I love seeing those zeros pop up on my screen. I love playing with the Blackest Night and seeing just how much I can mitigate and give my healers a break. To wrap things up, I think the 4 tanks are balanced very well, and the developers have to be careful about swinging too hard on buffs or nerfs to any of the tanks. Something I didn't touch on at all over the course of the video is the offensive prowess for the tanks. The Paladin, Warrior, Dark Knight, and Gunbreaker each have unique rotations. They are all based on a 1-2-3 combo, and they have branching abilities from there, but they go about dealing damage in different ways. Furthermore, the differences between damage output from the highest DPSing tank being the Gunbreaker to the lowest DPSing tank being the Dark Knight isn't a giant chasm, it's more like a tiny gap. So if any changes are going to be made to how abilities work on any of the tanks, you got to be very careful. You turn that knob just a little bit too much and things get out of control. But even when you consider the disparity in damage, it doesn't feel bad. You know, when I play the Gunbreaker, I don't feel like I'm doing an absurd amount of damage compared to the Dark Knight. I do realize that I am doing more DPS when I'm not messing up my rotation, but I am making other concessions when I play one over the other. I also didn't talk much about the supporting abilities for the tanks because it's the least interesting part about the tanking kits. The Paladin has the best support-oriented kit with Divine Veil, Passage of Arms, and Clemency, with all of the others falling into second place and fitting comfortably there. The Dark Knight and Gunbreaker's raid-wide mitigation could benefit from a buff that fits with the identity of the jobs, but even if they don't get buffed or tweaked, they get the job done. They feel fine. So with that said, I'm gonna stop comparing the tanks because I could go on about this forever. There are so many weeds that we could get lost in, and I'm just going to cut it off here. But if you'd like to talk more about this stuff, you can head to the comment section and leave a comment. How do you feel the other tanks compare to the Paladin? How do you think the Gunbreaker compares to the Warrior, or the Warrior to the Dark Knight? What's your favorite tank? There's so much that could go on in a discussion like this, and I would love to read your feedback and your ideas and your thoughts on this kind of stuff. And with all of that said, I'd like to give one more shout out to Tower Watch, my newest patron. In addition to everyone else that has provided patronage over the last month and beyond that, thank you so much for the support. It is really amazing, and it's difficult to put into words just how good it makes me feel. So thank you so much for the support. Now finally, if you'd like to support the channel more than you already do just by watching, liking, subscribing, and commenting, you can head over to patreon.com/iBluairJgR to become a patron. As always, the name of the game is Final Fantasy XIV, the name of the channel is iBluairJgR. There's plenty more content coming in the future, so stay tuned. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.